Hello class. Today we're going to discuss physical health and personality. How can something like personality impact your physiological well-being? All right. Is there some kind of relationship? Is it the case that some personality traits might lead you to be more predisposed to certain kinds of physical illness? So we're going to try to assess whether or not that's the case in this lecture. So first we're going to talk about stress in general. We're going to talk about the field of health psychology. And then we're going to talk about some research looking at specific personality types and their relationship to physiological health. And then we're going to move and talk about the Big Five and how the Big Five are related to physical health. So first, when we are discussing the relationship between personality and physical health, we are in the discipline of health psychology. It's a kind of psychology that doesn't get nearly as much press as it deserves. And also, if this is something that you're interested in, Dr. Michelle Hill teaches a class on health psychology every so often, and it's a wonderful elective. So health psychology is the scientific study about the relationship between the mind and someone's physical health, their body, all right? As well as ways in which these two components respond to challenges from the environment to produce either illness or health. Okay, so anything looking at the interaction between someone's physical health and their mind and their behavior, we're discussing health psychology. So questions about how well do people cope with stress? Do certain personality traits correlate with how people deal with stress? How do we get people to engage in pro-health behaviors like brushing their teeth, quitting smoking? We're in the field of health psychology. How do we get people to exercise? What is the impact of exercise on someone's memory and attention? That again is health psychology. What personality traits are correlated with both illness and good health? It's a question that we're asking today. That's in the field of health psychology. Now, a very important topic in health psychology is that of stress, something that we've talked that is very well known, something that we use in our daily lives. Oh, I'm so stressed out. Oh, this exam is causing me a lot of stress. So what is stress? Stress is not exactly an event. It's not an event. Stress is the subjective feeling produced by events that we believe are uncontrollable and threatening. All right, so stress is the response to a situation and not the situation itself. Well, let me tell you a little bit of a story about how health psychology really started. There was this researcher, Hans Selye, and Hans Selye was new to conducting research, and he recently got a job as a professor. And across the hall from him, in the lab across the way, someone had isolated this new hormone, which turned out to be testosterone, in animals. And no one knew what testosterone really did, so Hans Selye decided he was going to test this out. So what he did is he took a bunch of rats and injected half of them with testosterone, and the other half he injected with saline. Okay, saline is like a saltwater solution. It's essentially, we're controlling for the experience of being injected with something, right? And Hans Selye was going to see after a couple of weeks what ended up happening to these rats. Well, as I mentioned, Hans Selye was new to this research, so he wasn't that good at handling these rats, okay? He would hold them and he would drop them and he would have to chase them around with a broom to try to pick them back up. So these poor rats had to deal with his inept ability at handling rats. So a couple of weeks passed by, and Hans Selye looks at the rats that were injected with testosterone. Finds out that they have a bunch of ulcers, right? Stomach ulcers. Their cardiovascular system's not that good. So Hans Selye, you might assume, we'll assume that testosterone causes maybe stomach ulcers and poor cardiovascular health. But then he looked at the control rats. In the control rats, there was the same thing, right? Poor cardiovascular health, stomach ulcers. So why is this the case? Why in both situations did they develop these stomach ulcers? Well, it turns out that since Hans Selye was so bad at handling these rats, he was stressing the crap out of these rats. And they developed physiological symptoms from that. This is the first time in science that we are looking at a relationship between someone's stress and their physiological health. How can something mental end up causing something that's physical? Here we see our first example of this. So Hans Selye, from then on out, he, instead of studying, what testosterone does, is really looking at the impact of stress on physiological health. So that's what health psychologists do. Some other cool things that health psychologists do, maybe I shouldn't say the word cool. You got to be careful if you sign up for a health psychology study. One thing that they are known to do is, let's say that they're interested in the effects of stress on healing behavior. Well, every cut or scrape is different, right? So this person might be cut on their arm, this person might be cut on their leg, they might be different in depth. So how do we make sure that it's controlled, that these individuals are in the stress condition, these individuals are in no stress condition, and that the healing is exactly the same? Well, health psychologists have a device that they'll cut a little bit of your skin off, okay, in the same location, at the same depth, to see how it differs in different groups as to how it heals back. Another thing health psychologists are prone to do is say, hey, I've got, for your spring break, instead of doing, the typical spring break thing, we will include an all expenses paid. In fact, we'll give you some extra money to come up to a cabin for a week for spring break. What they don't tell you, well, they do tell you, I mean, it's got to be ethical. They tell you that you're going to this cabin, you're going to be locked in the cabin, and people are going to have the flu, and they're going to monitor who contracts the flu. So who's susceptible to a particular illness, maybe varying some psychological dimension, maybe you're looking at your personality, maybe you're looking at putting you in a stress condition or no stress condition. So health psychologists have an interesting wide variety of tools that they use at their disposal. If this is something that you're interested in, take the class with Michelle Hill, or there's this wonderful book that's written for a lay audience by Robert Sapolsky. Sapolsky is a neuroendocrinologist, so he studies the hormone system in both humans and non-human animals. He's from Stanford. He has a wonderful book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. All right, and kind of the premise of the book is that zebras engage in their stress response, let's say, if a lion appears. Okay, a lion appears, roar. Zebra has to engage in the stress system and pump all of the bodily resources to the zebra's legs and cardiovascular system so the zebra can get away. But after it gets away, it shuts down that stress response system. So it's not going to cause any ulcers or any major damage to the body. Human beings, on the other hand, we engage our stress response all the time, and we leave it on. If we're worried about a test coming up in 2 weeks, we might have a stress response now and keep it on for the entire 2 weeks. It's not very good for the body. Our body ends up breaking down. Leads to a lot of problems, leads to things like stomach ulcers. All right. So human beings engage in their stress response in situations where it's not useful, just in anticipation of something. So that's one of the premises of the book. All right, stressors are events that cause stress, right? Some qualities of stressors. Stressors are extreme. They produce the effect of individuals feeling overwhelmed, right? That someone cannot overcome the problem. Stressors tend to produce opposing tendencies. So let's say that you have a big test coming up. Well, you kind of want to approach the test because you want to succeed in the class. Running away from it, you wouldn't have to deal with the stress of taking the test, but you wouldn't do very well in the class. So there's this push and pull towards the stressor. All right. How about if you've got like a dance recital or something, right? You want to do it because you want to succeed, but also you feel stressed out about it. Okay. It causes you some anxiety. So there's this push-pull tendency with stressors. Stressors are uncontrollable. They are outside of someone's power, so they can't change the outcome of them. Okay. Well, let me back up. Stressors are outside of our influence. We feel like that we cannot control them. Stressors are not always a bad thing. All right. We can think of things like tests. Tests are uncontrollable. There's going to be a test for your final exam Tuesday. Not much you can do about that. public speaking. Maybe you have to give a speech in front of a class. Maybe you have a presentation at a conference. That date of the conference isn't going to change unless something major happens, maybe the coronavirus, maybe something else, but not much you can do. Stressors are not always a bad thing, as I mentioned. Probably one of the most stressful periods of my life was getting married, but that was a good thing. I'm really glad that I did that. It's both one of the most stressful times of my life and one of the happiest times of my life. So stressors don't just necessarily, are not just necessarily a bad thing. Hans Selye proposed that there was a 3-stage system of adaptation in case homeostasis is thrown out of whack. So let's say someone experiences a stressor. The first thing that the body does is it enters an alarm stage, and this is going to lead to a fight or flight response. Our sympathetic nervous system is going to be activated, and we're going to get ready to deal with the stressor, to run away from it, to punch it in the face, whatever it is. Okay, and it's good that this system exists, but if it is cut on for a prolonged period of time, we enter in a resistance stage. Now, when our sympathetic nervous system is activated, certain bodily functions cease. Okay, digestion, for instance, sexual behavior ends up ceasing. Well, it's more complicated with sexual behavior, but we don't start engaging in sexual behavior if the fight or flight response is activated. So there's many important biological processes that are not being taken care of. And we're converting all of our bodily resources to our cardiovascular system, to our muscles, to get us away from the situation. But the resources aren't devoted to other important areas. And if we spend up all of these resources, well, that's problematic. We're not going to have these resources to do other things. So as our resources end up being depleted, we enter in this resistance stage. This is where the body uses up all of its resources, even after the fight or flight response has subsided. And if we still are engaging in if we still experience the stressor, then we are going to enter into the exhaustion stage. The exhaustion stage, all of our bodily resources are used up, and here we're more susceptible to death, we're more susceptible to physical illness, we're more likely to get sick. All right, this is why after you study for an exam, final exams are over, sometimes people get sick right afterwards just because they've been engaging in all of the bodily resources in their fight or flight response, and immediately afterwards they don't have the resources to fight off illnesses and things like that. All right, so people enter the exhaustion stage. Okay, so how does personality relate to illness? Well, according to the health behavior model, there are 4 ways in which personality interacts with physical health. The first way is via someone's coping responses. How the individual deals with stress. Do they deal with it in a healthy way? Do they go see a therapist? Do they go out and exercise? Or do they go out and eat a ton of ice cream? Okay, how do people deal with their stress? Personality is going to dictate how people deal with this stress. All right, someone that's high in conscientiousness might go see a doctor. Someone low in conscientiousness might not. All right, so how do people cope with a particular stressor? Do you study for the test? Do you not study for the test? Personality might dictate this, might correlate with that. Also, another way in which personality might be related to physiological health is the appraisal of events. Is this thing stressful or is this not stressful? So personality might dictate that. Suppose you are high in openness to experience. Traveling to a new location isn't likely to be very stressful for you. You're not likely to interpret it as stressful. Whereas if you're low in openness to experience, that traveling to a new country or something might be very stressful for you. So the appraisal of an event might lead you to dictate whether or not something's stressful. Going to a party or something like that. Someone that's extroverted, that's not stressful for them. Someone more introverted, that might be stressful for them. All right. Personality might change what life events someone experiences. And this might be related to health. So who's more likely to smoke, for instance? Maybe who's more likely to use alcohol? Maybe who's more likely to get into fights? Who's more likely to put themselves in situations that are very stressful? Okay, personality might be correlated with people applying for a job that's going to be high stress. Now, there's going to be a lot of deadlines. Okay, maybe someone that's low in agreeableness gets into a lot of fights. If you engage in a lot of fights, you have to engage in your stress response for a long period of time. Okay, so what life events someone experiences might depend on their personality, and this might in turn impact their physical health. And the last thing is maybe personality is related to the health behaviors that someone engages in. Who's likely to brush their teeth? Who's likely to go to see a doctor? All of these might be related to personality and might impact health. Right? So we know that people that are high in conscientiousness are more likely to adhere to their diets. They're more likely to see a medical doctor when they have some physical issues. So in this way, personality might be correlated with someone's physical health. And here is a way of looking at that model. Okay, personality might impact the objective life events that someone experiences. The appraisal of these events as being stressful might impact how people deal with their coping responses with the stressor, and the health behaviors that someone engages in. And all of these are going to be related to whether or not someone experiences some physical illness. Someone experiences a stroke or a heart attack or high blood pressure or something like that, cancer. There might be another way. There might be a potential third variable problem, right? Maybe there is some gene, and that gene codes for a protein that both leads someone to be more susceptible to physical illness, and it impacts one's personality. So it's not really that personality is causing physical illness, it's that this gene causes both personality and physical illness. So that might be another way of looking at this, and it's really hard to tease these models apart. All right, let's move on to personality types. So first I want to talk about something that you've probably heard about a lot, both in psychology and in lay public, a collection of behaviors known as type A. Okay, typically we might refer to someone as being type A in their personality versus type B. So where does this come from? So some physicians, the first study was actually published in 1959, but these were cardiologists. Cardiologists were noticing that the typical patients that they were seeing that were suffering from heart attacks and strokes had a similar way in which they acted. They would behave very aggressively towards the doctors. They would constantly talk about them not having time to see and meet with the doctors. And the doctors would actually look at their seats in their waiting room, and they would see that the chairs in their waiting room were really worn down, but only at the edge of the chair. So people that were waiting in the waiting room of the cardiologist literally were on the edge of their seats. So these individuals that suffered from heart attacks and suffered from strokes had some similar characteristics in personality. So these cardiologists, and notice that these are cardiologists, not psychologists, ended up describing this behavior, this pattern of personality, as people having type A, or people having type A personality. So people were either type A or they were type B. All right. Now, this is a personality type and it's not a trait. So things should be already clicking in your mind somehow. Types are not the best way of distinguishing personality, right? You're either type A or you're type B. So that's what you should already be thinking about here. So what is type A? Well, let me back up. There's two misconceptions about type A. All right. The first misconception is that type A and type B are categorical differences, qualitative differences, that people are either type A or they're type B. In personality, this is never the case. Whatever dimension type A is, all right, it's continuously distributed and it's normally distributed, and there are people in the middle. This is the way with all personality traits. Whatever type A is, the same thing's going on here. The other misconception is that type A refers to a single personality trait. In fact, it's a collection of personality traits. 3 major subtraits go into defining someone as being type A. First one is competitive achievement motivation. Competitive achievement motivation, people that score high in this are people that constantly want to look for competition and to win that competition. All right. If you're playing a game of tic-tac-toe, they want to, do best out of 9 or something like that. They are always going to try to make something about a competition. My mother is very high in competitive achievement motivation. When we would go to the beach when I was younger, and we would play beach games like bocce ball or ladder toss or anything along those lines, my mother would want to keep a record of how many times people won throughout the entire beach trip so that someone could be crowned the grand champion or so. No one else cared about this except for my mother, but she was very, very cared a whole lot about winning this. So people that are constantly looking at competition and wanting to win things, that like to overcome obstacles, they're high in achievement motivation, competitive achievement motivation rather. All right. If you're someone that prefers to play games in which there's winners or losers, as opposed to games like Candyland, you're probably high in competitive achievement motivation. All right. Subtrait number 2, this is time urgency. People that are type A hate wasting time. All right. If there's someone that's slower than them on the interstate and they're behind them, they're going to get mad because they could get to their location maybe a minute or 2 earlier, so they're very angry that you're wasting their time. All right. In a doctor's office, they're going to hate waiting for the doctor to see them. All right. They view that their time is very valuable and they're always going to be rushing to certain locations, and they feel a lot of pressure to get the most done in the least amount of time. The last component of being type A is hostility. When individuals that are type A are blocked from their goals, they're going to have an aggressive response. They're going to lash out and yell, punch people in the face. Yeah, that's a little extreme, but they're going to behave in a very aggressive manner. So to be type A, you have to have all of these components to it. So these cardiologists, and again, cardiologists, not psychologists, found that people that were more likely to suffer from cardiovascular disease were type A. So psychologists said, oh, this is cool. Let's try to study this. But something weird happened. Okay. When psychologists tried to study type A, it was uncorrelated with physical health. So with medical doctors, there was the relationship. With psychologists, there was not this relationship. Okay. That's weird. Now, the way that they were measured, that cardiologists measured type A and the way that psychologists did was different. So medical doctors, cardiologists would assess type A through interviews, and psychologists would assess it via questionnaires, so self-report questionnaires, Likert type items that we've seen time and time again. For psychologists, they equally emphasize these 3 components: time urgency, competitive achievement motivation, and hostility. They don't find the relationship. With physicians, they emphasize the assessment of hostility in type A individuals. They didn't really assess time urgency and competitive achievement motivation as much with their interview. Cardiologists, good at being heart surgeons, not necessarily best at measuring personality. But it makes sense that that's a psychologist thing to do. So evidence from these questionnaire measures began to show that general type A personality does not predict heart disease. In fact, the only part of type A that predicts heart disease is the hostility component. So time urgency is uncorrelated with physical health. Competitive achievement motivation, even though these people might be annoying, so at times, not related to physiological health. Only the hostility the aggressiveness, the viewing everything as, you know, wanting to fight somebody, engaging in that fight or flight response over a long period of time, that's related to physical health. All right. So some researchers have shown that the questionnaire measure for specific trait of hostility ends up being a better predictor for artery disease, things like heart attack, than questionnaire measures of type A. Another interesting thing that I want to point out here that I don't have on my slides is this type A research was very, very big in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And around the 90s is when it fizzled out. Now, some of the people that funded a lot of this type A research, and one of the reasons that we heard so much about it is because tobacco companies ended up funding a lot of this research, this psychological research. Why? Well, tobacco companies did not want to show that tobacco was causing a lot of cardiovascular disease. They wanted there to be some other aspect. So they really wanted this research to be prominent so that they could say, well, you know, there's many causes of heart disease that are not just tobacco. So maybe it's the case that your personality, if you had a better personality about things, you would not develop a physical disease. See, tobacco's not that bad in the first place. So there's some fishiness going on with some of this research and where it's funded. But psychologists were quick, or somewhat quick, to take this down and examine the usefulness of this type A conception. Okay, how does hostility affect the physiological system? Well, hostility is associated with systematic inflammation. We see elevated levels of white blood cells. Okay, inflammation is related to a lot of diseases, and in fact, some research suggests that anxiety and depression lead to a lot of inflammation in the physiological system. All right, so we see the link between hostility and white blood cell count, so an indirect measure of inflammation, remains even after we account for age, sex, smoking history, and alcohol intake. So there does seem to be a relationship here between how aggressive you are and and your level of cardiovascular health. So is it okay to have type A personality? Well, it depends on which part of it you have. Time urgency and competitive achievement motivation are fine to have. They're unrelated to cardiovascular health. Hostility is going to lead to a lot of problems. Some other researchers have looked at other types of personality and how they might impact physical health. Your book talks about type T, as in Tyler. I'm going to talk about type D. D stands for the distressed personality type. There are two underlying traits for this. There's negative affect. All right, this is the tendency for someone to experience negative emotions. And social inhibition, so the tendency to inhibit the expression of emotion. So the tendency to not express a lot of emotions, thoughts with other people. And as it turns out, you really have to have both of these subtraits of negative affect and social inhibition before you are at risk for cardiovascular disease. Now, you'll notice that type A personality, we're looking at someone's agreeableness, kind of, right? Kind of a Django fallacy here if we're looking at hostility. Type D here tends to be something like neuroticism, right? So maybe we have a Django fallacy here, and we're just studying the same thing that we could just call neuroticism. One thing that I do want to mention, some positive aspect of improving health and the relationship between it and psychology, is that of disclosure. The research, Pennebaker has done a lot of research looking at disclosure and its impact on physical health. Pennebaker asked older adults who have lost their significant other, ask them, hey, have you talked about your loss with somebody? And they either say yes or no, or the extent to which they have talked about their loss. And if they've communicated about their loss, they spend a great deal of time dealing with that issue, well, then they're likely to live a longer period of time. Whereas if they internalize all of the stress from losing their loved one, they're more likely to pass away in a shorter amount of time. All right, so one great thing about psychotherapy, and not just psychotherapy, but maybe writing in a journal, is that it leads to the expression of these negative emotions, which actually has a profound impact on your health. All right. So Pennebaker looked at individuals that experienced some kind of traumatic episode, had some individuals write in the journal about it, other individuals not write in the journal. And what Pennebaker ended up finding is that individuals that wrote about the trauma in their journal ended up being healthier, were less likely to get sick, less likely to suffer from cardiovascular disease than individuals that did not write their feelings down. All right. So the last thing that I want to leave us on is the relationship between our big 5 personality traits and physical health. And by this point in time in the class, you could probably guess what traits have the most impact on physiological health. So the biggest correlates are obviously neuroticism and conscientiousness. But with agreeableness and extroversion, there is some relationship. So extroversion has a very indirect relationship with physical health. People who are extroverted are more likely to drink larger amounts of alcohol. They're more likely to smoke. They're more likely to have more sexual partners. So these might lead them to have worse physical health, but then again, they have more friends. They are more likely to express their emotions. So they experience more positive emotions. So in this way, that might help their physical health. So the relationship between extroversion and physical health is murky, and there's some things counting against extroversion, some things counting for extroversion. Agreeableness, okay? Agreeableness, as we mentioned before, hostility, okay? Low agreeableness is related to cardiovascular disease. Agreeableness is also related to the amount of social support that somebody has. The more social support that you have, the more likely you are to deal with trauma in an effective way. All right, but the general trait of agreeableness does not have a strong relationship with physical health. Conscientiousness has the best predictive capabilities of physiological health. People that are high in conscientiousness are more likely to stick to their diets. They are more likely to not consume too much alcohol. They're more likely to exercise. They're more likely to go see a doctor. They're less likely to procrastinate, so they don't deal with nearly as much stress. So conscientiousness ends up being the best predictor here of physiological health. Neuroticism is also a strong predictor here. So the more neurotic someone is, the worse their health is. People that are high in neuroticism are more likely to engage in their stress response for a longer period of time. People high in neuroticism are more likely to ruminate. What does ruminate actually mean? A lot of you are from North Georgia. You might have some experience with cows. Rumination is the process in cows. Okay, we're going to talk about what it means in cows, and we're going to talk about what it means in human beings. So bear with me for a moment. Cows, as you might know, have 4 stomachs. So the way that they digest their food, they eat the grass, goes into one stomach, then they throw it back up in their mouth. They chew a little bit more, and then goes to another stomach. This process is called rumination. So why am I talking about this? Someone that's high in neuroticism is likely to ruminate about negative experiences they have. They might say something dumb early on in the day, and they might think about it for the next week or two. When someone that's low in neuroticism says something dumb all the time, they just forget about it. They don't let it bother them. So ruminating is going to engage in that stress response for a long period of time, and is very problematic to engage in for that long period of time. We enter the exhaustion phase of the general adaptation syndrome that Silly talked about. Openness to experience, not a very strong relationship with physical health. Okay, a bit of a shorter lecture, but we are closing on the end of things. Hope you guys have a great day, and I will talk with you later. Bye-bye.